They took your name, your land, your language, but not your legacy. Reclaim it at AfricanAncestry.com.
So what do we learn about Louise Langdon Little? We learned that she was a fighter from Frontier. She was born here. She wanted to be a teacher, and I don't understand this quite, but she only could go up to the 5th form because there were no more schools after that here. So she became a seamstress, but she read and wrote prodigiously. They actually have records of her giving speeches from her books and people being totally bowled away by her speeches. She was a smart woman. She didn't want to be a seamstress, but her grandmother said to her, you know, you got to figure out a way to make some money, and this is a reliable way to make money where you don't necessarily have to clean white people's houses. Because as you know, that's what most Black women did, not only in the United States, where as of 1940, 70% of us were made, but here on the island and in the islands and on the African continent. So as we claim Louise Little, what we claim about her that's important is that this is a transatlantic experience. She understood and claimed her African roots. She talked about Africa. She had an uncle who basically would get livid. One of her school books called the Caribs, the Indians here, savages. And she said, oh no, they're not savages. So she was very conscious. So the Indian presence was here as well, but they're born here, immigrating first to Canada and then to the United States. So you're looking at 3 major influences. She met her husband through her uncle, and he was a rabid, and rabid is the wrong word, just an enthusiastic, fully immersed member of Marcus Garvey's United Negro Improvement Association. So he was into that, and she became into that. In fact, it's very interesting that their bond was not necessarily a romantic bond. They were bound by the movement. Now, they were into each other. If you don't have like 6 kids in 10 years without having something going on. But the fact is that they would fall out. He told her he was widowed. He lied. He had a wife who was still alive. She didn't touch him for a year after that. But then when she did, it got another kid. So there was something going on. They also had other squabbles because she did not eat pork, nor would she cook it. He often ordered her to do it. In one instance, he struck her because she refused to do the pork. But with all their ups and downs, it's the movement that bonded them. She loved him because he loved Black people. And so that's really kind of important. Marcus Garvey, at one point, according to one of the books, and they go back and forth, Garvey stayed with the Littles at a point in time when he came to the United States. That clearly flagged them for federal attention because obviously he had been described as one of the most dangerous Negroes in the United States. So once they owned property, they moved around. They moved from Canada, Philly, Milwaukee, Omaha, where they hanged a Black man 2 months before they moved there. And this had a horrible impact on her. But she never stopped. Indeed, one of the things that Jessica Russell writes about, as well as Merrill Collins, is the extent to which she provided supplemental homeschooling for her children. They would come home and tell them what the teacher said. It would be a lie about Black people. And we say, let's read this again. Let's unpack this again. She was passionate. Because they own land, you know, Black people are not supposed to own land, or anything for that matter. Because they own land, they were targeted by social workers and judges and the police. She fought back at every turn. And the fighting back is what got her in a mental institution for almost 25 years. She never yielded. When you look at Ms. Russell's book, she talks about some of the stupid questions the social workers asked her, and the way she answered them, they were answers of resistance. You know, I had a little mental issue one time Well, I've had several, but that's not the point. But I remember it was really funny when they sent me to some psychiatrist. The man said, "Who won the Civil War?" And I said, "Black people." And he said, "Ma'am, you're trying to pass this test. Who won the Civil War?" I said, "What you want me to say?" We went back and forth for 30 minutes. And he diagnosed me with oppositional personality disorder. I'm like, all right, what we gonna do with that? But when the psychiatrists are white and the patients are black, we see the world very differently. So that many instances of where she just resisted, and they didn't like the fact that she resisted. And that really is a context. So the question really is, as we look at Louise, there's so many things to say. But the tragedy of her life, well, let me go back. She was multilingual. Mm-hmm. She was an excellent writer. She wrote it for the Negro World, which was the UNIA's newspaper. She also was the secretary, so she kept records on who joined the UNIA, meticulous records. Mm-hmm. And even as pregnant with a newborn, she continued to participate in the conferences and all of that. She was a committed advocate. One of her biographers describes her as a Garvey missionary. And that's why they moved around so much. They moved when the UNIA told them to move, they moved. They were obedient. They were passionate about this. And she even wrote about how come a Negro can't say, and she lists some of the things that people said a Negro could not say. How come a Negro can't say? So we're looking at a warrior here. So when people talk about Malcolm X, they have to talk about his mother, her brilliance, the fact that she read widely, wrote just prolifically, went to the schools and challenged the teachers. Now we're talking, the the early 20th century, 1920, 1921, 1922, up to 1930. She's challenging teachers. Now some parents are afraid to do that today. So we have to appreciate all of that. Now, the tragedy of her life, her husband was, well, never mind, I'm not gonna go there, but he apparently was the misogynoir that many Black women experience. She experienced from him. She loved him. She was committed to his cause. But anyway, Earl Little was killed. They had a $10,000 insurance policy, which they had scraped to put together. However, the insurance company said he committed suicide by laying on the railroad tracks. And they were never able to collect that policy, which many of the sources say they worked hard to produce that policy. They put nickels and pennies aside to make sure they could pay for the premiums of that policy. So absent the payment of the policy, there was a provision in the state she was in that said, if your husband was killed, you got a widow's pension. Wasn't much, but it was something. However, there was a morality clause connected to the widow's pension. She took up with some man. She was a younger woman. People have needs. The man also had said he would take care of that, but when she became pregnant again, he was like, oh no, I'm up out of here. The state invoked the morality clause to take her money away. They said she was pregnant out of wedlock, and therefore they were going to take her money away. And that was a downward spiral that ended her up in a mental institution. And so, a lot of people say, well, Malcolm's mother was in the mental institution. Let's tell the whole story. He said, what did he say? He said, it was white supremacy that shattered my family. Once she went into the institution, the brother Wilfred, who's the oldest, and he was most loyal to his mother, he petitioned the courts more than 15 times to get his mother out. They would always turn him down. The entire family was scattered, this one here, this one there. He took the time and the effort to go child to child to child with his siblings to make sure they knew what each other was up to. That was a value that she had instilled on them around the issue of family. So and like I said, 15 times rather, over 20 years, lots of expense. They finally were able to get her released. and she moved in with one of her children to a place outside of Grand Rapids, Michigan. I wanted to talk about this just a bit because we're here to celebrate, lift up Louise. But I don't think we can without having the total context of what all happened to her. And then to make the parallel between what happened to her and what happened to so many Black women we're facing with institutional and structural racism and sexism, when the stereotypes of us become the determining factor in what we are allowed and what we receive. And the extent to which so many of us, not all of us certainly, but many are basically cowed down, bowed down. I often think, when I think about her, and I was thinking about this morning, I think about the scene in The Color Purple where Oprah would not bow down. The Oprah, what was her name? Miss somebody other. But she, yeah, okay, thank you. I can't remember everything. I am a woman of a certain age. But anyway, she refused. They beat the you-know-what out of her and forced her to bow down. And I think of Louise Little, and I think the same thing. They forced her. She was a proud woman who owned property. They didn't want her to have that property. And there's a history of folks not wanting Black folks to have property. And so they bust up the family, took the property, and that's a tragedy. But here's the triumph. The triumph is Malcolm X. Number one, he was influenced by his mother. She was an amazing speaker, according to all who report on it. She was an amazing writer. Jessica, I think her name was Jessica, the white woman. Yeah, Jessica. She went back and looked at some of her articles to talk about how well written her articles were. Malcolm X was also a great writer. And so basically what you're seeing is a case of this woman shaping her son even as they were separated from each other. So that's a triumph. The triumph is the story of Malcolm X. And here's the other triumph. We have the memory of Louise. If anybody ever thinks they need to be humble, I hate that word, either humble and who needs to bow down. She told her boys, look up. He said, they don't bow down, look up.